Well, the Honorable Kevin Rudd served as the 26th Prime Minister of Australia. He is currently the president of the Asia Society and the author of the fantastic new book, The Avoidable War. Mr. Rudd, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Great to be on the Climate Pod and great to be with you Climateers.
Well, you have such a phenomenal background. Obviously, I think many of our listeners know you speak Mandarin, you speak English. Reading the book and listening to some of your past talks, it's incredible how much reading you've done on American and Chinese culture. And having served as Prime Minister of Australia, you worked with several Chinese and American leaders, including President Xi, President Biden during the Obama administration. And now as president of the Asia Society, you're helping to create better ties between Asia and the West, and are helping to do that with your new book, The Avoidable War. So as a world leader with this experience, it's very obvious to me why you're uniquely positioned to work on these issues. But what made you want to dedicate this part of your career to this work and this writing?
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. You said before I speak Chinese and English. Well, actually, I speak Chinese and Australian. And if you've spent time in Australia yourself, the British constantly critique us for bastardizing English language completely. Mind you, if you study linguistic history, the Australian dialect of English, according to linguistic historians, is that which nearest approximates English as spoken in Shakespeare's time. And so when you therefore listen to Australian English, you are listening to William Shakespeare, the great bard of English literature. And that really horrifies the British completely. So anyway, after that gratuitous introduction, the bottom line is, why do I do what I do? I'm by instinct a global citizen, and therefore I am obviously passionately Australian, but you cannot in the 21st century conclude that you have a national future in the absence of an international future. That applies to the seamlessness of security policy, foreign policy, economic policy, and climate policy, as well as, if you like, immigration policy. These things all flow one into the other, and managing the politics and the policy of all those domains, for me, it just makes sense. If you wish through that level of international engagement, craft a more humane, a more secure, a more prosperous, and certainly a more sustainable future for us all. So without being too kind of lofty about it all, I've just seen the challenge as being, how do you bring people together in a way which produces better outcomes, as opposed to what people normally do, which is line up at 20 paces and start taking pot shots at each other.
And as we know, this is a critical decade for global cooperation on so many levels. In the book, The Avoidable War, you call the decade that we're living in now, the 2020s, the decade of living dangerously with regards to Chinese-American relations. What do you think is so pivotal and potentially dangerous about our current moment?
Well, yeah, I finished the book on Christmas Day in 2021. So it predates the Ukraine crisis. It predates the current ongoing small sea crisis over Taiwan. But without claiming to have access to a personal crystal ball, if you've been in the business of geopolitics long enough, you're trained to understand where the trend lines are taking you. And the trend lines are taking us, as far as US-China is concerned, in an increasingly bifurcated world. If you broaden that out to the postures taken by Russia, China, and for that matter, Iran, it's becoming a bifurcated world between the democratic world on the one hand and authoritarian regimes on the other. And because of that level of both geopolitical and, shall I say, ideological bifurcation, this binary system is undermining the capacity of the global rules-based order to deliver sufficient climate outcomes. And that's what I continue to chip away with, albeit now at a think tank level.
Obviously, with any kind of global agreement, whether it be climate or otherwise, trust is so essential, especially when you have things like a non-binding emission reductions agreements like the Paris Agreement, you chronicle American-Chinese relationships throughout a long history in the Avoidable War, and how that trust has been forged and how that trust has broken down at times between nations. President Xi has now been in leadership during the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. What are some of the ways in which you've seen that trust between the Americans and Chinese evolve during President Xi's time in office?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is we can't deliver all this at America's feet, because Xi Jinping has also changed the game plan. And we need to step back just for a moment and understand why things have changed. One is the balance of power has been changing in China's favor, both militarily, economically, and technologically, and in terms of, frankly, foreign policy footprint over that decade, because Xi Jinping is set about to change the status quo. His mission statement is to turn China into the preeminent regional and global power. And whether you like it or not, however you dress it up, the bottom line is that therefore is a direct strategic challenge to the United States. The second thing is that whereas the balance of power is changing, Xi Jinping's predisposition as a national political leader is also different from his predecessors. His predecessors were more cautious. Xi Jinping is more assertive. His predecessors were happy to use Deng Xiaoping's phrase, to hide their strength, bide their time, and never take the lead. Xi Jinping, if we were to give him a motto in the United States, it would be being loud and proud. And then on top of that, you have himself believing, a bit like Putin, that he's a man of history, which means that he's about to change lines on maps. Look at Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, as opposed to kicking that can down the road, which was the predisposition of his predecessors. And so these two sets of factors, which is the balance of power, but also the nature of Xi Jinping's leadership, brings about dynamics of fundamental change. And what's happened really since about 2017, 2018, is the United States has begun institutionally to respond to that. Firstly, by redefining the relationship as strategic competition rather than strategic engagement. And then secondly, under the Biden administration, systematizing an approach across American friends, partners, and allies across the world to begin to respond to this increasing assertion of Chinese global and regional power. So as they say in the classics, it takes two to tango. And so in the midst of all that, it is almost an inevitable consequence that strategic trust, to the extent that it existed before, has been significantly corroded. The argument I put in my book, which is not just a description of what's unfolded, but a prescription for the future as well, which is about managed strategic competition, is that managed strategic competition as a concept doesn't rest on the idea that we'll all have a kumbaya moment, sit in the backyard under the banyan tree and have a temporary moment of enlightenment and realize that we all love each other. I've been around the race course and the racetrack too many times to actually believe that that happens. Both human beings and national political systems are too interest-driven for that to occur. But my concept of managed strategic competition argues from a realist premise that neither side at this stage wanted to tripwire their way into accidental crisis, conflict, and war. And there are therefore exit ramps that we can productively explore and walk down. And that's what work I've been seeking to do with both the US administration and with the Chinese.
Yeah, managed strategic competition is part of the joint strategic framework that you've developed that you'd like to see these countries adopt to avoid war. What else makes up this framework?
Yeah, well, it takes the reality as it is at present, rather than, as I said, trying to sprinkle fairy dust over the top and hope that it would look different. I grew up on an Australian farm. We tend to call a spade a shovel. So it's kind of there. So what do we do about it? As opposed to normatively saying, oh, I wish they would just understand each other more, because ain't gonna happen. So therefore, managed strategic competition has 4 points to it. One is You identify the 5 areas of what I describe as strategic red lines between these two countries. Over Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, Korean Peninsula, plus cyber and space. And within those 5 strategic red line areas for each side, you use high-level diplomacy to communicate to the other side what your irreducible red lines are. At present, what happens is that this is done by a elevated system of push and shove. One side pushes, and the other side shoves. And one side pushes, the other side shoves. I'm sure because you're such a pacifist culture in America, when you observe kids in the playground, unlike in Australia, kids never fall down. Well, they often do fall down on the playground in Australia because someone pushes too hard. And then it's on for young and old. So I think that's not a terribly sophisticated way to proceed at this stage. But every day of the week, the American Armed Forces, the Navy, the Air Force, other elements of the US military are engaged in a series of push and shove exercises against their Chinese opponents. And there's not just there, but it's against the Taiwanese in the Taiwan Strait. It's also in the East China Sea around Sankoku Diaoyudao. And I just get very worried about too much metal navigating its way around metal because metal tends to, at certain points, collide. So therefore, the objective is, through the approach I recommend, is to cause each side to know what the other's irreducible red lines are. This will not be a perfect process, it'll be an imperfect process, but I argue on balance it's better than the current one, so that you then habituate the behavioral patterns around that, so that the other side knows that if they violate the first side's self-defined red lines, that there'll be a reaction. So you want to go that way, fine, but you don't need to be a road scholar to work out that something bad's going to happen in response. On balance, I think that's more stabilized than where we are at the moment. The other 2 or 3 elements are much easier to explain. The second element is, if you can do the first element okay, you can then agree on a joint framework of what I describe as non-lethal competition in all other domains. The rest of security policy, the rest of all of foreign policy, economic policy, trade, investment, technology markets, capital markets, plus ideation, ideology, human rights, where there's a great contest of ideas for the future of the international order. And then thirdly, you should also be able to create sufficient political and diplomatic space for China and the United States then to collaborate on global public goods, which are in their own national interests. Climate, of course, stands out there as numero uno, because look at California burning and look at China in flood and the impact on, frankly, agricultural harvests in both countries. We who look at the climate science literature have been predicting this for 20 years. And well, hold the phone, it's happening, you know. Well, funny about that, our humorless scientists in white coats obviously just write these reports for fun over the last 20 years. But actually they were predicting the unfolding reality. It's happening. Therefore, it's in the interest of both sides to collaborate. But beyond climate, it's also the next pandemic and global public health more generally. Beyond that, again, it is also global financial stability, because I'm a survivor of the global financial crisis, and that's when my hair finally turned white. Because that was a near-run thing for the whole show blowing up completely. As well as nuclear weapons proliferation to third countries beyond the existing nuclear weapon states. And the final element of the logic is, if those 3 elements of managed strategic competition could be agreed as part of a joint strategic framework, I always say, may the best team win. You've got to have sufficient opportunity in that for the Chinese authoritarian worldview to believe it can compete in a non-lethal way for global hearts and minds. I personally back team freedom, but that's just old-fashioned of me. And I think we have a more compelling narrative. But I think that's the way in which you could do it. And you need, at the end of the day, a very small team of the most senior officials on both sides. Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, possibly Secretary of Defense, and Chinese counterparts to have a rolling daily hotline to police these arrangements. And this is kind of what the Americans did with the Soviets after the near-death experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. So we've been around this race course before. I hate to think we've got to have another Cuban Missile Crisis before we say, oh my God, why don't we have joint strategic competition and managed strategic competition instead? I'll stop there, but that's the gospel according to Kevin. Sorry about it.
Well, yeah, you write in the book that to avoid crossing those red lines, to any hope of these countries working together on international topics like climate, that the American leaders must understand Chinese intentions and President Xi's motivations. What do you think that many American leaders are missing when it comes to President Xi's motivations?
I think the understanding of Xi Jinping's motivational framework, as I outline in the book with what I call 10 concentric circles of Chinese interest under Xi Jinping's leadership, starting from staying in power through to changing the rules of the international system, and all points domestic and foreign in between. I think there is a failure to fully comprehend domestically in the United States that China is not 10 feet tall. It's more like 5'9". Uncle Sam is probably about 6'2". China's still growing. Question for America is whether it still wants to grow, or whether, in the Chinese view, a natural aging factor is set in to the United States, and therefore you're in a national psychology of, shall we say, incremental retreat, of which the early harbinger was Trumpian isolationism. So I think understanding that, objectively speaking, China at this stage is not some overwhelming giant. The second thing is to have a close look at the dynamics unfolding in the Chinese economy. And in the Chinese economy, it's not a lay down misere. Do you have that term in American English? Like, it's not inevitable. There you go. It's a hand of cards whereby, blump, there you go. I've trumped a lot of you. It's not inevitable that China will end up as this vastly dominant global economy. It may turn out that way, but because you've had a domestic triumph of Chinese politics and ideological control over an innovative private sector, China's growth in the last several years has been slowing significantly year on year. And so when you start to look at Chinese growth this year of maybe 2 or 3%, as opposed to historical norms of double digit, the normal compounding effect of China's double-digit growth over the decades has been to produce phantasmagorical numbers for the future. It may not turn out that way. And the reason Xi Jinping's doing it is for domestic control reasons. If there's a third thing, it would be this. Despite the fact that Xi Jinping's power is all-encompassing, the system itself is not monolithic underneath him, and there are a range of views. And therefore, sophisticated American diplomacy doesn't lump together A, China, B, with the Communist Party. Sorry, that was my cat. Or C, the leadership of Xi Jinping. These are intersecting sets, but they're not, as it were, coterminous sets.
You mentioned that you listed President Xi's top 10 priorities in the book. You place environmental sustainability as the 4th highest on the list. Why do you feel environmental sustainability is such an important issue to Xi, and how has this changed?
Yeah, this has been quite a radical and recent change, evolving over the last decade. The Chinese finally concluded on the science of climate change around about 2007. It didn't translate its way through to policy, probably for another 5 years or so, and then was taken further by Xi Jinping's working relationship with Obama in the lead up to the Paris treaty or agreement or accord of 2015. So the reason it's evolved that way is because political legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party doesn't simply proceed from the barrel of a gun. There has to be a level of performative legitimacy as well. It's an imprecise cocktail between around the ultimate social contract between the Chinese people and the Communist Party, which is we, the Chinese people, are prepared to allow you, the Chinese Communist Party, to still retain political power. But in exchange for that, we want to be lifted out of poverty. We want to have rising living standards and decent jobs for everybody and a better life. Thank you very much. Oh, and by the way, the formula you've used that for the previous 35 years has destroyed clean air, clean water, and non-polluted soil to grow our crops and veggies in. So we are grumpy about that. And we are sick and tired of people now developing a whole bunch of respiratory diseases from particulate matter pollution in China's major cities. We're sick and tired of food security crises as crops are grown in polluted soil or irrigated with polluted water. So for that reason, I'd say around about 2015, 2016, it went from being a scientific conclusion on the part of the regime that, we'd better do something about this climate stuff, through to, oh my God, the peasants are revolting. And we'd better actually do something much more quickly. Of course, that has taken Chinese policy activity from stasis to near inertia to what I describe as reasonable activity. We need to get China to here in order to make a material change to the planet. But having been with China when they were here, I'm always pleased that they're here, while still goading our Chinese friends to get over to here. Mind you, they always say, and look at Donald Trump.
Well, is it important for President Xi and for China to be seen internationally as a leader in sustainability or in clean energy development?
It is. It's important legitimizing force, because I said before that the Chinese Communist Party is not simply dependent on the brutal exercise of military or coercive power, although that is the core of the system, as we've seen most recently, as demonstrated in their response to Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. I think the Chinese are also seeking to have an increasing degree of performative legitimacy internationally. And so that means performing better on China's aid delivery to the rest of the world. You see some evolution of that, not as fast as it needs to be, from traditional Chinese bilateral aid flows, which are largely focused on building soccer stadiums, through to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is building power stations, through to building the Belt and Road Initiative without coal-fired power stations, the most recent decision. We'll wait to see how it's operationalized. Through to a broader role in international governance on the question of climate responsibility. So there is leverage to be applied there, in particular by the developing world, by emerging countries, emerging markets, the G77. So I think that is a big factor in terms of leveraging China against its, shall we say, international global performative reputation. And if I look carefully at what has happened in the last year or two, after Xi Jinping adopted his three positions, carbon neutrality by 2060, carbon peaking by 2030, and the abolition of Chinese financed coal-fired power stations for BRI countries. As of now, though let's wait and see. Each of these undertakings is not ambitious enough. But the way the Chinese system works is that once numero uno has laid down the law, it's a bit like watching sort of the mobilization of a Sherman tank, you know. Suddenly all these things are then translated into the central planning apparatus of the national government, the provincial government, the municipal government. The reward and punishment structures and systems for officials are calibrated accordingly. So that has happened, although the Chinese energy shortage crisis of the winter of 21-22 has slowed China's operational commitment to those planning parameters put in place following Xi's 3 sets of commitments, all of which happened in partial response to global pressure on China, primarily, however, driven by domestic need, but driven also by the desire to burnish his and the country's and the party's international reputation.
Yeah, you mentioned just a minute ago about Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and the pledge to, quote, defend its freedom in the face of aggression. You know, we had during COP26 this announcement by China and the United States to hold critical climate talks on issues like scaling clean energy, reducing methane emissions, improving climate action in cities, and developing more sustainable economies. And this is really encouraging for us because obviously the United States is historically the largest emitter. China is currently, annually going to be the largest emitter in 2022 in terms of carbon emissions. It was great to see those two world powers making an announcement that they are going to work together. Then we had Speaker Pelosi's visit, and China canceled climate talks with the United States as a result. What did you make of this recent incident?
Yeah, well, the future of the planet, it does depend on these two giant elephants in the global living room, with India crashing through the window in terms of aggregate emissions. China, of course, is number one now in terms of annual emissions. The United States number 2, but India rising. And I think from memory, the relativities are about 25% of emissions to 16% of emissions in the US case, down to about 7% of emissions in India's case. But India will eventually surpass the United States when India becomes the most populous nation on earth in the period ahead, and it's still behind on the development curve. So given all the above, it's quite critical that these three work together, but let's just take the US and China first, because between them, they represent getting close to half of global emissions annually, and cumulatively represent the biggest stack. The Europeans, of course, have a big cumulative stack as well of emissions, so we shouldn't let those guys off the hook just because they make nice fondues. So I'm, as I said at the outset, just a realist about how the hell you get stuff done, as opposed to permanently pontificating about it. So I'm a huge supporter of what John Kerry has been trying to do with his counterpart, Xie Jinping. I've known Xie Jinping for about 15 years. He's been China's chief climate negotiator. I was talking to him literally last week. Well, actually 2 weeks ago, as we ran through the upcoming slate of activity between himself and John Kerry's team. And then, of course, we have the Pelosi, pardon the pun, but missile amidships, which has derailed all of that. On the question of one of the reasons why I advocate a comprehensive joint strategic framework between the United States and China is that we cannot simply cherry pick what we want to do and what we don't want to do, either on Beijing's part or Washington's part. Some people will say, for example, why can't you just do climate and forget about the rest? Well, in the real world of geopolitics, it doesn't quite work that way, which is why you need a comprehensive joint strategic framework so that you can be managing daily encounters in the Taiwan Straits on the same day as your negotiators are meeting in Geneva for a week to work through the next phase of the global climate agenda. At present, we've got a series of arrangements within the international system, but in particular bilaterally between the United States and China, whereby the Chinese in particular will say, we can't advance progress in this while you're bringing about regress in that. And the United States in some areas of its own is doing the same as well. I'm sorry, I'm just moving my cat. This is May, by the way, from the New York Cat Rescue Society. Say hi to everybody.
Adorable.
It's absolutely adorable.
She's she was found in a box in Chinatown in New York with her sister. And so we got them from the Cat Rescue Society, and she occasionally jumps up to be part of podcasts and stuff. And her major effort was on CNN one day when she emerged. So my apologies for May's temporary presence.
Oh, that has happened on this end as well. So no worries at all. We're very pet friendly on the Climate Pod, as you might imagine.
Yeah. We got dogs and cats kicking around the place. That's just who we are. So where was I before you rudely interrupted me, Kat? What was I talking about?
Well, we're talking about kind of where we are between the United States and China negotiations, especially after Speaker Pelosi.
Yeah. So therefore, I have been a critic of Nancy Pelosi's decision to travel to Taiwan because I ask myself this question. Are the people of Taiwan more or less secure as a result of this visit? And is the US-China relationship more or less stable because of this visit? And my answer to both those questions is as follows: no and no. Therefore, I ask myself why. And I'm all for burning political capital in prosecuting critical national security and economic interests in our relationship with China when it's worthwhile. But there's a great temptation in this country, in particular the United States, to confuse what I describe as symbolic acts from substantive acts. And if you're concerned about the security of Taiwan, I would much rather spend that political capital further reinforcing Taiwan's national defenses through military supplies to Taiwan, making it more of a resilient national security entity like Ukraine has proven to be, rather than, frankly, expend that capital on something else, like this particular visit. Furthermore, you've then got collateral damage. All four of the existing mill-to-mill direct communications links between China and the United States have been abolished by the Chinese. This is not good if you're trying to bring about a negotiated set of 5 strategic red lines that I spoke about before. Secondly, it's also not good in terms of your areas of defined collaboration on global public goods, like climate. So anyway, that's why I, both before Pelosi went and after, I've been critical of both the idea and then the reality. In terms of where to from here, given shit happens and shit has happened, then my argument would be to both the principal climate policy chiefs, John Kerry and Xie Jinping, to continue beavering away on their bilateral agenda against the time that it can be resumed, and to be equally resilient in their efforts to support domestic policy action on climate. And to be fair to the United States, the Biden administration's passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, $300 billion investment into greenhouse gas mitigation projects, has a serious capacity to draw down American emissions in reality by something in the order of 40% by 2030. And this is probably the single largest climate based investment that we've seen by any US administration and frankly by any global government. So continuing to operate nationally, and I think the Chinese more or less will seek to do that nationally for their own national and long-term global interests. Continue to, as it were, below the radar, advance the bilateral agenda between them in the absence of formal meetings. And then thirdly, when the political atmosphere returns to something approaching normality, which I hope would be in the period following the 20th Party Congress in October, November, maybe towards year's end, that we could get back to direct or indirect engagement between the two sides on climate.
We touched on a few minutes ago the fact that China did announce that they would be carbon neutral by 2060, which is a decade later than the promises of almost every other country. Why do you think China's stated goals for decarbonization are less aggressive than the public pledges of the United States or other countries?
Well, the Chinese place ideological and political and certainly economic significance on the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change doctrine of common but differentiated responsibilities. That is, there's a common responsibility to act for the planet, but differentiated between developed and developing countries. And China still self-describes as developing. That is their reason, their stated reason for it. I think there's a further reason for it, which is they're quite nervous about an accelerated transition. And the coal lobby in China is very strong and pointed to the energy supply interruptions, which occurred over the winter of 21-22. But thirdly, the pattern I've seen emerging with China is they do prefer to underpromise and overdeliver. And so I'd not be surprised if this is brought into a nearer time frame at some point. I can't say when. But the truth is, and I say this quite bluntly to the Chinese, unless you get to carbon neutrality by 2050 and carbon peaking by 25, 26, then to quote the great Australian philosophers, we're all buggered because it's just going to be too little too late. To which the Chinese have an answer. So, well, what about Uncle Sam? What about the Indians, etc.? And speaking of India, in fairness to China, India's commitment to carbon neutrality is 2070. I'll be planning a political comeback in 2070, so I should be around for that. So I mean, as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long term, we're all dead. And so you've got to have something where the definition of long term is at least within your own lifetime. So I think Modi and the Indian system have answers to deliver as well. But I'm headed to India soon, in the next week or two, to speak with Indian counterparts about this. And I think there is the beginning of a sea change in Indian politics on this question. If you look at the most recent parliamentary and legislative actions by the Indian government on its commitments at Glasgow, this is the first time they've achieved, as it were, material legal and regulatory regimes for enforcement. So it's too slow by way of progress, but turning the Queen Mary around takes a fair bit of time.
You talked about the Chinese energy crisis last winter, and in February, before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia and China agreed to a 30-year gas deal via the Power of Siberia pipeline. But with Russia cutting off its gas supply to Europe now, what impact is this having on energy exports from Russia to China?
They're being turbocharged. You see that in the import-export data. And remember that China's transition still leaves a lot of room for gas until the renewable energy transformation is more complete. So is it unfortunate? Yes. But is it terminal to China's renewable energy transition arrangements? I don't think so. And then on the flip side of this, what does it do in Europe? It turbocharges the renewable energy transformation in Europe, although there'll be stopgap LNG supplies in order to meet immediate shortfalls. So the great thing about renewable energy from a national security perspective is it's secure, it's local, much harder to interdict in terms of either oil tankers, international gas pipelines, or that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and you have a really, I know you get asked all the time about what the example of Ukraine could mean to how President Xi views Taiwan. I think you have a really interesting answer on this. And I know you're much more skeptical that this is going to have any impact on President Xi's outlook on Taiwan. So as you see it now in 2022, how do you think President Xi views Taiwan and how it relates to his legacy?
Within the Chinese Communist Party, reunification with Taiwan is kind of like a matter of high theology. And having grown up as a Roman Catholic, I kind of know what that's about. So in other words, it's kind of there permanently hovering over you as a set of deep ideological commitments, which must be realized at some point. I think secondly, where Xi Jinping has changed the ballgame is that for the first time since the Cultural Revolution, which finished in 1976, we've had a Chinese leader indicate a timetable. And what he has said is that you cannot achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049, by which time we intend to become the preeminent regional and global power, in the absence of reunification with Taiwan. So whether we like it or not, we're now on a 27-year slope. In other words, it's gone from abstract time to historical time, which thirdly brings us to the question of when. I'm much more concerned about, frankly, late 20s, early 30s than I am about next week, next month, or next year. The reason for my book is because for the decade of living dangerously, what I want is a set of arrangements which reduce the risk of crisis, escalation, conflict, and war by accident in that period of time. Of course, I'm then critiqued legitimately by saying this just kicks the can down the road in terms of war by design. But if in the intervening 7 to 10 years, you have a new set of deterrents constructed by the United States, its allies, and with the Taiwanese indigenously, it may well be that Xi Jinping's military advisors say to him then, I'm sorry, Chairman Xi, but it's still too risky. So I'm all for kicking the can down the road if the alternative is the cleansing and clarifying experience of war. Read the literature in 1914. A lot of these guys back then thought what Europe needed was just a good war to sort it all out. Well, that turned out pretty well. It effectively screwed an entire century. So navigating our way through on Taiwan and other issues through until the end of the decade or early next decade, I think is critical. And then it may well be that a different set of military and technological circumstances are capable of deterring China from acting at that stage.
You know, you write in the book that America's international strength relies on its allies. And, you know, and the United States, I think, has lost some standing with its allies in recent decades because of the Iraq War, because of the global financial crisis, and more recently, the Trump administration. How damaging do you think the Trump administration, its decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement, and it's just overall rise of nationalism in the United States, how damaging do you think that could be to America's relationship with its allies?
How do I put this delicately? As a nonpartisan think tank in the United States, it hasn't been helpful. And that's because one thing that your allies around the world, both in Asia and Europe, have assumed is the reliability of American power. And the Trump administration, led by the president himself, less by others in the administration, set about fundamentally destabilizing its alliance partnerships with relationships with Japan, with the Republic of Korea, with Germany, and more broadly with NATO. And as a consequence, this has a lasting residue. And as a consequence, again, the question left in the minds of allied capitals is, what happens if Trump comes back? What if the Republicans under Trump's influence are back? What will that mean for the future? So there is a deep question kicking around in the back of the cerebral cortex of most of your allies who have become professional at analyzing, by necessity, US domestic politics. So I think that's one factor. The second and broader factor goes back across the reach of time, as you've just suggested. The Second Iraq War of 2003 was an utterly avoidable war. I was in Australian politics at the time, vocally opposed it, as did my party. We were then in opposition in Australia. And because we could not see the basis for that war in terms of sufficient evidence that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, which were capable of threatening the outside world. And of course, that skepticism ultimately proved to be well-founded. And therefore, not just the bleeding of American resources in this long-standing crisis of Iraqi politics since 2003, nearly 20 years now, has been huge. The disillusionment of US body politic about the wisdom of foreign military ventures bled straight into Trumpian isolationism. And then thirdly, your international friends and allies, when faced with the question of the fabric of international law and Article 2 of the UN Charter, which prescribes the use of force or the threat of the use of force to solve international disputes, learning from the history of the Second World War, found it very difficult to defend the US action in 2003 on the basis of international law. Some of us warned at the time that if we are casual about our attitude to armed invasions around the world in the absence of the fortifying position of international law, then we do create precedents for others. Look at Russia and Ukraine. So, so for those reasons, there is a combined impact of these various measures over time, which have not contributed to rock solid confidence across all your allies that if we have a Republican administration after 24, that it will simply be the America of old. There is still a skepticism as to what that will mean in practice.
And I had to imagine that's, well, it certainly extends to climate, right? Because President Trump pulled out the Paris Agreement. And now we've had this major bill, as you mentioned, go through Congress in the United States. This is going to help President Biden's agenda. And the United States has not been a great actor in the international community on climate. Do you think this most recent bill shifts that perception at all?
I think when it's probably articulated, yes. I mean, the Trump legacy on climate is, as you just described, the unilateral withdrawal from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change ranks up with the dumbest decision by any US administration after the decision by the Trump administration to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But in terms of the gold, silver, and bronze medals for dumbness, withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and yielding all of Asia to China economically as a consequence that's Dumb and Dumber. The silver medal would be the withdrawal from the UNFCCC, because then that basically destroys not just your economic credentials, but your climate credentials. And then by withdrawing unilaterally from the Human Rights Council in Geneva, you're basically then ceding that institution's future to a bunch of bad actors. So that gets the bronze, in my view. So turning that around, which is what the Biden administration, thank God, has successfully done in the last 18 months, has been a critical piece of work. Rejoining the UNFCCC, becoming a principal player again, as they were with Obama in 2015. On the economic front, IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which while not anywhere near the market access arrangements on trade that were alive in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is at least a step in the right direction, and rejoining the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So the Biden administration are obviously internationally literate. Trump prided himself in his illiteracy.
With the minute we have left here, just to wrap up, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the major climate bill working its way through Australia's parliament as well. Labor is back in power. I know you've worked closely with Prime Minister Albanese. He's been a close colleague in the past. What do you make of Australia's current efforts on climate in 2022?
Well, this has been a similar sea change in Australia that you've had in the United States. I mean, I went back to Australia to campaign in the federal election for one primary reason, which is to break the nexus, help break the nexus in terms of the previous Conservative government of Australia's Trumpian approach to climate irresponsibility. And so, but under Prime Minister Albanese's leadership and the rest of his team, and a few of us who were campaigning in purple seats or purple districts around the country, we got across the line. The new government's formed. It had articulated a clear-cut, not just policy objective, but a detailed operationalisation strategy for 43% emissions cuts by 2030. That's now working its way through the parliament successfully. And it is not just a notional goal, it also legislatively triggers a whole series of actions within it, which have already been pre-negotiated with industry, both the agricultural sector, as well as the manufacturing sector, as well as the mining sector. So it may well be that we had to go through the pain that we went through with the massive climate politics engendered by my efforts to do the same more than a decade ago, when we legislated a carbon price, only to see the Conservatives repeal it, aided and abetted by the support of the Murdoch media, that we finally, a decade later, prevailed. I'm not sure whether it was Martin Luther King who invented the quote, but he certainly used it, that the arc of history bends slowly towards justice. This is an elemental investment in climate justice. It sometimes takes political and strategic patience for those of us who are battle-scarred veterans in the field, some of whom have lost limbs on the way through. But I'm pretty proud of what the government has been able to pull off, and it's really its first legislative act. It was Parliament was convened 2 weeks ago. This was into the Parliament 5 days later, bang. And it's now working its way through the Senate, should be through anytime soon.
Well, you've written an absolutely incredible book. Again, it's called The Avoidable War, The Dangers of Catastrophic Conflict Between the U.S. and Xi Jinping's China. Mr. Rudd, thank you for writing the book. This is one of the best looks you're going to have at geopolitics in 2022 and understanding the relationship between two great powers. So, Mr. Rudd, such an honor to have you on. Thank you again for joining us on the Climate Pod.
Well, thank you for having me. And now that I'm in retail, thank you for the free plug for my book.